Hello there, night wanderers and seekers of hidden truths. Before we dive into tonight's unsettling tale, tell me, how has your day been treating you? What time is it where you are in the world right now? Wherever you are, whatever time has brought you here, I'm grateful you found your way to Sleep Theories. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. We have so many more dark corners of history to explore together, so many more buried truths waiting to be unearthed. So dim the lights, settle in, and let me tell you about the Maronei files. My name is Daniel Havers and I should have died in 1987. That's not melodrama speaking, it's mathematics. Cold clinical probability based on actuarial tables that nobody at Plessy Defence Systems ever bothered to calculate. If they had, they might have noticed that working on certain projects carried mortality rates that would make insurance companies weep and statisticians reach for stronger drinks. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with Vimal. Vimal Dyatlov was the closest thing to a genius I'd ever met, though he wore his brilliance like an old cardigan, comfortable, unassuming, slightly threadbare at the elbows. When I started my internship at Plessy's Christchurch facility in September 1986, fresh out of university with a computer science degree and delusions of importance, Vimal took me under his wing without fanfare or ceremony. Systems analysis, he'd tell me as we hunched over terminals displaying cascades of green text, is like being a detective for machines. You look for patterns, inconsistencies, the places where logic breaks down. His voice carried the faint accent of his Gujarati childhood, though he'd lived in Hampshire for 15 years by then. Vimal was 34, married to a teacher named Priya, father to twin girls who giggled at his terrible jokes. He drove a sensible Vauxhall, ate packed lunches that smelled of cardamom and turmeric, and had recently been promoted to lead systems analyst on what he called the big project, though he never elaborated on what made it big. The promotion came in October, along with a new security clearance that required additional background checks and a signed agreement that ran to 17 pages of dense legal text. I remember him waving it at me with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Cosmic clearance," he said. "Sounds like something from Doctor Who, doesn't it?" But the joke stopped after that. Over the following weeks, Vimal grew quiet, distracted. He'd stare at his screen for minutes without typing, or startle when I approached his desk. The bags under his eyes deepened, and Priya called the office twice, asking if he was working late again. "Are you all right?" I asked him one November evening as we walked to the car park together. The Hampshire air was sharp with approaching winter, and our breath formed small clouds in the fluorescent glow of the security lights. He stopped walking and looked at me for a long moment. "Daniel," he said finally, "do you ever get the feeling you're being watched?" I glanced around the empty car park. "Here? Everywhere." He fumbled with his keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock his Vauxhall. "It's probably nothing. New project stress, you know. High security work does things to your head." That was Thursday, November 13th. Friday the 14th, Vimal didn't come to work. His desk sat empty, computer screen dark, packed lunch still in the communal refrigerator, growing more pungent by the hour. Monday morning, our section chief, a thin, nervous man named Garrett who always looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, called us into the conference room. His hands shook as he read from a prepared statement. "It is with deep regret that I must inform you of the death of our colleague, Vimal Dyatlov. Mr. Dyatlov died on Friday evening as the result of a fall from the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol. The coroner has ruled the death a suicide." The words hit like physical blows. Suicide? Vimal, who'd shown me pictures of his daughter's first day at school just 2 weeks prior. Vimal, who'd been excited about the new project, who'd just been promoted, who talked about taking Priya to Italy for their anniversary. I raised my hand, feeling stupid even as I did it. "Sir, are you certain? About the suicide ruling, I mean?" Garrett's eyes found mine across the table, and for just a moment I saw something there that might have been fear. "The investigation is complete, Mr. Havers. The matter is closed." But it wasn't closed. Not for me. That evening I drove to Bristol. I'm not sure what I hoped to find. Closure, perhaps, or some detail that would make sense of the senseless. The Clifton Suspension Bridge stretched across the Avon Gorge like a Victorian monument to human ambition, its towers disappearing into low-hanging mist. I spoke to a homeless man who'd been sleeping rough near the bridge approach. His name was Tommy, and his eyes held the peculiar clarity that sometimes comes with living on society's margins. Saw the whole thing, he told me, accepting the sandwich and thermos of tea I'd brought. Wasn't right, though. Not like the others. Others? People jump, they're upset, crying, making a scene. This fellow, he just stood there for the longest time, calm as you please. Then suddenly, like someone flipped a switch, he climbed over the railing and let go. Never made a sound. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Did you see anyone else? Anyone who might have been with him? Tommy's weathered face creased in concentration. Matter of fact, yes, 2 men in dark coats. They left right after he went over. Walked away like nothing happened. Didn't even look back. I pressed a £20 note into his hand and asked him to keep quiet about our conversation. He nodded, understanding passing between us without words. Driving back to Hampshire that night, Vimal's voice echoed in my memory. Do you ever get the feeling you're being watched? He'd told me the night before his death that he couldn't sleep, that he felt watched. I'd assumed it was paranoia, the kind of occupational hazard that comes with high-security clearance work. Now I wondered if Vimal Dajibai had been the most clear-eyed person I'd ever known. The human mind seeks patterns. It's an evolutionary advantage that helped our ancestors distinguish between rustling grass caused by wind and rustling grass concealing predators. But sometimes, pattern recognition becomes its own kind of trap. You start seeing connections everywhere, even where none exist. Or so I told myself as I began collecting newspaper clippings. It started innocently enough. A few days after Vimal's funeral, a heartbreaking affair where Priya sat stone-faced while her daughters asked why Daddy couldn't come home, I found myself in the library, scrolling through microfilm records of recent obituaries. I told myself I was looking for closure, trying to understand how someone so full of life could simply vanish. What I found instead was Arshad Sharif. The obituary was brief, tucked between notices for retired headmasters and beloved grandmothers. Arshad Sharif, 26, systems engineer at Marconi Space and Defence Systems, died October 5th in Oxfordshire, death by misadventure, survived by parents and one sister. Misadventure. The euphemism sat uneasily in my mind as I scrolled further back, cross-referencing dates and companies. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical baths. Dr. Keith Bowden, 36, found dead in his overturned car near Aldershot, March 1987. The vehicle had somehow flipped on a straight stretch of road with no apparent cause. Police attributed the accident to drunk driving, though his wife insisted Keith hadn't touched alcohol since their wedding day 3 years prior. Shani Warren, 26, discovered bound and gagged in a lake near Reading, April 1987. Despite the restraints, the coroner ruled it suicide. When I read that detail, I had to set the microfilm reader aside and step outside for air. Trevor Knight, 52, found dead at his home from cyanide poisoning, August 1987. No suicide note, no history of depression. He'd been working on radar systems for Marconi's Stanmore facility. The list grew longer each evening as I returned to the library after work, claiming overtime I wasn't actually doing. Dr. John Britton, electrocuted in his garage. Professor David Sands drove his car into a building at high speed with no apparent cause. Richard Pugh found hanging in his flat, though neighbours reported no signs of distress. Each death carried official explanations that felt increasingly hollow. Suicide, accident, misadventure. Clinical terms that obscured rather than illuminated. But 2 connections ran through every case like red thread through canvas. First, each victim had worked for Marconi, Plessey, GEC, BAE Systems, or their various subsidiaries. Second, each had held security clearances for NATO's Strategic Defence Initiative, the satellite-based missile defence system the Americans were calling Star Wars. By December 1987, my collection filled 2 manila folders hidden beneath my mattress, like some adolescent's guilty magazine stash. 23 deaths in 5 years, all connected to Britain's most sensitive defence projects. The statistical probability of such a cluster occurring naturally was so remote as to be meaningless. I knew I was walking into dangerous territory. The Official Secrets Act made simply possessing some of this information a criminal offence, but Vimmel's face haunted my dreams, and his daughter's questions at the funeral echoed in quiet moments. When is Daddy coming home? That's when I decided to make contact with someone who might have answers. Margaret Thorne had worked as a civilian liaison between the Ministry of Defence and various contractors throughout the 1980s. Her name appeared in several news articles about defence spending, always identified with the same generic title, MOD spokesperson. But a bit of digging through public records revealed she'd taken early retirement in late 1987. Around the same time the death toll was reaching its peak. I found her address through the electoral roll and drove to her cottage in the Cotswolds on a grey Saturday morning in January 1988. The building sat behind a well-maintained garden, smoke curling from its chimney into the winter sky. She answered the door herself, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and intelligent grey eyes that seemed to evaluate me before I'd spoken a word. "Mrs. Thorne, my name is Daniel Havers. I worked, with someone I believe you might have known, Vimmel Dajibai." Her face changed almost imperceptibly, a tightening around the eyes. "You'd better come in." Her sitting room was warm and cluttered with books, cats, and the debris of a life lived away from government offices. She made tea without asking if I wanted any, giving us both time to settle into the gravity of the conversation ahead. "You were friends with Mr. Dajibai?" she asked, settling into an armchair with a tabby cat immediately claiming her lap. "He was my mentor at Plessy, a good man, a careful man, not someone who would—" I let the sentence hang unfinished. "No," she said quietly, "he wouldn't." We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the cat's purring and the whisper of wind against windows. "How many others have you identified?" she asked finally. The question confirmed what I'd hoped and feared. I wasn't the first person to notice the pattern. 23? Maybe more? She nodded slowly. I had 27 when I stopped counting. "Why did you stop?" Her laugh held no humour. "Because I wanted to see my pension, Mr. Havers. Because some knowledge comes with a price, and I wasn't prepared to pay it." But she was prepared to share what she knew, perhaps because isolation had made the burden too heavy to carry alone. Over the next 2 hours, Margaret Thorne painted a picture of defence contracting that bore little resemblance to the patriotic endeavour described in government white papers. The Americans were pushing hard for cooperation on SDI, she explained, but they wanted more than just missile defence. They were interested in what they called ancillary applications, ways to use the same technology for other purposes. "What kind of purposes?" She was quiet for a long moment, stroking the cat's fur. "Have you heard of Project Pandora, Mr. Havers?" I hadn't. American research program from the 1960s and 70s. Officially, it studied the health effects of microwave radiation on embassy staff in Moscow. Unofficially, ... She paused, choosing her words carefully. They were looking into whether focused electromagnetic fields could affect human behaviour, cognitive function, decision-making processes. The implications hit me like cold water. Mind control. Influence, she corrected. The technology was never refined enough for direct control, but disruption, confusion, implanting suggestions in moments of vulnerability. That showed promise. She rose and moved to a bookshelf, returning with a thin folder marked with official stamps I recognised from my security briefings. These are declassified portions of reports I helped compile, technical assessments of what our contractors were developing for the Americans. The documents were heavily redacted, black bars obscuring most content, but enough remained to sketch the outlines of something vast and unsettling. References to cognitive disruption arrays and neural resonance testing, mentions of satellite-based systems capable of targeting individual brain frequencies from orbit. They called it the Black Echo Array, Margaret said. Theoretical, of course. At least that's what we told Parliament when questions were raised. But it wasn't theoretical. No, Mr. Havers, it wasn't. She explained how testing had begun at Porton Down, the government's chemical and biological research facility. Initially, they'd used volunteers, soldiers and civilian employees who were told they were participating in studies on equipment safety. But as the technology became more sophisticated, the ethical boundaries grew blurred. Some subjects began experiencing side effects, severe depression, paranoid thoughts, insomnia. A few became suicidal. The program was supposed to be shut down in 1985, but the Americans were very interested in the results. And when Americans express interest in British defence technology, careers are made or broken based on cooperation. I thought of Vimal standing in the car park asking if I ever felt watched, of Arshad Sharif found tied to a tree with a shotgun, of Shani Warren, bound and gagged, but ruled a suicide. You think they were test subjects? Margaret nodded grimly. I think they discovered what they were working on, and I think they objected. She walked me to the door as afternoon shadows lengthened across her garden. Be careful, Mr. Havers. Some secrets have bodyguards. Driving back to Hampshire that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that a car was following me, maintaining distance but never quite disappearing from my rearview mirror. Paranoia, I told myself, the same occupational hazard that had affected Vimal. But when I pulled into my flat's car park, the headlights behind me continued past without slowing, and I noticed for the first time how exposed I felt walking across the open space to my front door. Sleep became elusive after my conversation with Margaret Thorne. I would lie awake parsing her words, turning them over like puzzle pieces that refused to fit together properly. The black echo array, neural resonance testing, cognitive disruption. By day I maintained the facade of a dutiful intern, processing routine systems analyses and pretending not to notice how my colleagues avoided discussing Vimal. But evenings found me hunched over library tables, following paper trails through academic journals and declassified government documents. The breakthrough came in February 1988, buried in a footnote of a Pentagon technical report I'd requested through Freedom of Information channels. Project Pandora hadn't ended in the 1970s. It had evolved, spawning classified programs with names like Monarch, Sleeping Beauty and Black Echo. The science was surprisingly straightforward once you grasped the fundamentals. The human brain operates on electrical impulses, generating measurable electromagnetic fields. Different mental states, sleep, stress, fear, confusion, produce distinct frequency signatures. If you could identify these signatures, the theory went, you could potentially influence them using targeted electromagnetic radiation. Microwave frequencies proved particularly effective. Unlike radio waves, they could be focused into tight beams capable of affecting individual targets from considerable distances. The technology already existed in radar systems. It simply required refinement and miniaturization. What the Americans had discovered, and what British contractors were helping to perfect, was a weapons system that could make targets experience any desired mental state. Depression, paranoia, suicidal ideation, all without leaving physical evidence of intervention. I found confirmation in an unlikely source, a medical journal article about microwave exposure symptoms among radar technicians. The list read like a catalogue of behaviours exhibited by many of the deceased scientists: severe insomnia, paranoid thoughts, depression, disorientation, compulsive behaviours, in extreme cases self-harm. The article's author, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, worked at a neurological research institute in Edinburgh. I called her office on a Tuesday morning, identifying myself as a graduate student researching occupational health hazards in the defence industry. Electromagnetic effects on neural tissue, she said when I explained my interest. Yes, it's a fascinating field, and deeply concerning if you ask me. Concerning how? Well, the applications are rather obvious, aren't they? If you can induce specific mental states remotely, you've essentially weaponized psychology itself. She agreed to meet when I explained I was investigating possible electromagnetic exposure among recently deceased colleagues. Her institute occupied a converted Victorian mansion overlooking Edinburgh's New Town, all Gothic revival architecture and modern security systems. Dr. Hartwell was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 40, with the intense focus of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms. She led me to her office, a cluttered space dominated by anatomical charts of the human brain and electromagnetic field generators that looked like science fiction props. "Show me your data," she said without preamble. I spread my files across her desk, 27 names now, each with detailed circumstances of death and employment history. She studied them with the methodical attention of a pathologist, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification. "Remarkable," she said finally. "The pattern is quite clear once you know what to look for." "You see it too?" "Oh yes. And it's not random." She pulled out a map of Britain and began marking locations with coloured pins. "Look at the geographic distribution. Most of these deaths occurred within a 50-mile radius of 3 locations: Portondown, RAF Fylingdales, and the Marconi facility at Chelmsford. The pins formed rough triangles across the map, each vertex corresponding to a known government research facility. Now look at the timing." She consulted a calendar, marking dates with different colours. The deaths cluster around specific periods, always following major project milestones or security reviews. The pattern was undeniable once visualised. Each spike in mortality corresponded to phases when classified projects were being evaluated, or personnel were undergoing enhanced security screening. "They were being selected," I said, the realisation hitting like a physical blow. "Or eliminated," Dr. Hartwell corrected grimly. "The question is whether they were test subjects who became liabilities, or potential whistleblowers who needed silencing." She showed me technical papers describing the effects of pulsed microwave radiation on brain tissue. Specific frequencies could induce seizures, hallucinations, or overwhelming despair. The technology was precise enough to target individuals while leaving nearby people unaffected. "The beauty of it, from an operational standpoint," she explained with clinical detachment, "is that victims typically attribute the effects to stress, mental illness, or personal problems. They rarely suspect external influence. Until it's too late." "Exactly. By the time symptoms become severe enough to seek help, the psychological manipulation is often irreversible. The brain essentially programs itself for self-destruction." I thought of Wimmel's final weeks, his growing paranoia and insomnia. Had he been experiencing the early stages of microwave-induced psychological breakdown? Was his suicide the final phase of a process that had begun the moment he received cosmic clearance? Dr. Hartwell agreed to examine the available medical records of the deceased scientists. What she found confirmed our worst suspicions. Many had sought treatment for identical symptoms in the weeks before their deaths: insomnia, paranoid thoughts, severe depression appearing suddenly in previously stable individuals. "The psychiatric profiles are virtually identical," she told me during a follow-up phone call. "It's as if they were all suffering from the same specific neurological disorder, one that doesn't exist naturally." "Can you prove electromagnetic exposure?" "Not definitively. The effects mimic naturally occurring conditions too closely. But the statistical clustering is impossible to explain through conventional causes." She agreed to document her findings in a formal report, though she warned that publication through normal channels would be impossible. "This kind of research tends to make editors nervous," she said with dark humour. That evening, I sat in my flat reviewing everything we'd discovered. The pattern was clear. Scientists working on classified electromagnetic weapons projects were dying under suspicious circumstances that perfectly matched the symptoms of microwave-induced psychological manipulation. They weren't committing suicide. They were being murdered by the very technology they'd helped create. The phone rang at 2:17 a.m, startling me from uneasy sleep. The voice on the other end was electronically distorted, gender and accent obscured beyond recognition. "Stop looking into things that don't concern you, Mr. Havers." "Who is this?" "A friend. Someone who doesn't want to see your name added to the list." The line went dead. I checked the locks on my door and windows, then sat in the dark for the rest of the night, watching the empty street through a gap in the curtains. No cars passed, no pedestrians walked the pavement, but I had the distinct impression that eyes were watching from the shadows, measuring my movements and finding them wanting. The next morning I called in sick to work and drove to London. If someone was monitoring my activities, I needed allies, people with the resources and connections to make this information public. It was time to breach the walls of secrecy, no matter the cost. Finding sympathetic journalists proved more difficult than I'd anticipated. The first 3 reporters I approached listened politely to my story, asked for documentation, then declined to pursue the matter after consulting with editorial staff. One was honest enough to admit that stories involving classified defence projects were problematic from a legal standpoint. The fourth, however, was different. Sarah Chen worked for the Guardian's investigative unit, a slight woman in her 30s with sharp eyes, and the kind of sceptical intelligence that made sources either flee or confess everything. We met at a pub in Bloomsbury, sitting in a corner booth where conversations were obscured by the evening crowd's ambient noise. 27 deaths, she said after reviewing my files, all connected to defence contractors, all ruled suicide or accident despite suspicious circumstances, and all working on the same classified projects. She made notes in shorthand, occasionally pausing to ask pointed questions that demonstrated she understood the implications better than I'd hoped. When I finished explaining the electromagnetic weapons connection, she sat quietly for several minutes weighing what she'd heard. "This is potentially explosive," she said finally, "but it's also completely unprovable through normal means. No official will confirm classified project details, and without inside sources—" "What if I could get you inside sources?" Her expression sharpened. "You have access to classified materials." I hesitated. What I was contemplating would end my career and possibly land me in prison. But Vimmel's face floated in my memory, along with the faces of 26 others whose deaths had been dismissed as unfortunate coincidences. I might be able to access certain files, hypothetically. Hypothetically, that would be extremely dangerous for both of us. But you'd be interested. Sarah Chen smiled for the first time that evening. Hypothetically, I'd be very interested. We arranged to meet again in a week, giving me time to assess my options at Plessy. The facility's security was thorough but not impregnable. My internship provided access to the general computing network, and certain terminals were occasionally left logged in by careless employees. The opportunity came on a Friday evening in March. Most of the staff had left early for a colleague's retirement party, leaving the facility nearly empty. I'd volunteered to stay behind, claiming I wanted to finish a routine analysis without distraction. At 8:30 p.m, I slipped into Garrett's office. Our section chief was paranoid about security and meetings, but surprisingly lax about his personal workspace. His terminal was still logged in, screensaver displaying the Plessy logo in endless loops. My hands shook as I navigated through directory structures I wasn't supposed to access. The files I sought were buried deep in the system, protected by passwords and encryption protocols designed to deter casual snooping. But Garrett's credentials provided higher access than I'd expected, and within 30 minutes I'd located a folder labelled GEC Black Coordination. The files inside were a roadmap to systematic murder disguised as national security. Memoranda dated throughout 1987 discussed cognitive breach risks among personnel with cosmic clearance. Individuals showing signs of operational security concerns were flagged for enhanced monitoring and intervention protocols. The language was bureaucratic, sanitized, but the implications were clear. One document marked Confidential Operation Silence contained a list of names that made my blood freeze. Vimal Dajibai was there, along with most of the other deceased scientists from my research. Each name was followed by a coded assessment. Cognitive breach confirmed. Intervention authorized. Post-operational disposal complete. They weren't just tracking the deaths, they were ordering them. Another file detailed the technical specifications of something called the Black Echo Array. The system consisted of satellite-based microwave transmitters capable of targeting individuals anywhere on Earth with precise electromagnetic frequencies. The satellites were already in orbit, launched under the cover of communications and GPS missions. The targeting system was terrifyingly sophisticated. Using electromagnetic resonance signatures unique to each individual, think of them as neurological fingerprints, the system could affect specific targets while leaving nearby people completely unaffected. Range was theoretically unlimited as long as the target was outdoors or in buildings with minimal electromagnetic shielding. A technical manual described the process in clinical detail. Target identification through security file cross-reference. Neurological mapping using covert scanning during routine security interviews. frequency calibration based on individual resonance patterns, graduated exposure protocol to induce desired psychological states, final intervention to ensure operational security maintenance. They'd turned assassination into a bureaucratic process, complete with flowcharts and quality control measures. The most chilling document was labelled Porton Down Test Results. It described trials conducted on volunteer subjects who'd been told they were participating in equipment safety studies. The volunteers weren't told about the microwave exposure, instead being monitored for psychological changes over periods ranging from days to months. The results were devastating. Subjects exposed to specific frequencies developed severe depression within 72 hours. Others became paranoid, convinced they were being watched or followed. The most susceptible individuals progressed to active suicidal ideation within a week of initial exposure. Cognitive disruption protocols demonstrate 94% effectiveness across sample population, the report concluded. Recommend immediate deployment for operational security applications. I copied everything onto multiple floppy disks, my hands trembling as the ancient computer drives whirred and clicked. Each file represented lives destroyed, families shattered, truths buried beneath official lies. But it was also evidence, proof that the deaths weren't random, weren't suicides, weren't accidents. They were executions. I'd just finished copying the last file when I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. My heart hammered as I quickly logged out of Garrett's terminal and slipped the disks into my jacket pocket. The footsteps passed without pausing, but the moment served as a stark reminder of how exposed I was. Driving home through empty Hampshire roads, I kept checking my rearview mirror for following headlights. The discs in my pocket felt like they weighed tons, each one a potential death sentence if discovered. But they were also hope, the first tangible proof that Vimal and the others had been murdered. I hid the discs behind a loose baseboard in my bedroom, then lay awake until dawn, wondering how many more names would be added to the list, before someone had the courage to make it public. The answer, as it turned out, was at least one more. The phone call came at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday, jolting me from the first decent sleep I'd managed in weeks. The voice belonged to someone I'd almost forgotten, James Kirkpatrick, a former Plessey technician who'd worked on early radar systems before transferring to a civilian contractor. "Daniel. Christ, I hope this is still your number. We need to talk." His voice carried an edge of panic that cut through my morning grogginess like cold water. "James? What's wrong?" "Not over the phone. Can you meet me today?" We arranged to meet at a motorway service station between our respective locations, neutral ground where casual surveillance would be obvious. I spent the 3-hour drive wondering what could have prompted contact from someone I'd barely known during my brief overlap with his final months at Plessey. I found him at a corner table in the restaurant section, nursing a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. James Kirkpatrick had aged years in the months since I'd last seen him. His hair had gone grey at the temples and his hands showed a tremor that hadn't been there before. "You look like hell," I told him as I sat down. "Feel worse." He glanced around the restaurant nervously. "I heard about your friend Vimal, and about you asking questions." "From who?" "People talk, Daniel, especially when someone starts connecting dots that weren't meant to be connected." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I worked on the early prototypes, you know, back in 84 and 85 before I got smart and transferred out." "Prototypes of what?" "The microwave arrays, the targeting systems, the whole bloody nightmare." His laugh held no humour. "We thought we were building defensive systems, jamming equipment to protect our satellites from Soviet interference. Nobody told us we were creating weapons that could scramble people's brains from orbit." James had been part of the original engineering team that developed the focusing mechanisms for the Black Echo array. His job had been optimizing power distribution and targeting accuracy. Technical challenges that seemed innocuous without context. "The breakthrough came in late 85, he explained. "We achieved the ability to focus microwave beams with surgical precision over intercontinental distances. The Americans were ecstatic. They started talking about alternative applications and dual-use protocols." "When did you realise what they meant?" "When the first volunteers started showing up at the base hospital with psychiatric symptoms. Depression, paranoia, suicidal thoughts. all appearing suddenly and perfectly healthy individuals. He stared into his cold tea. I put two and two together when I realised the timing correlated with our testing schedule. Like several other engineers, James had tried to raise concerns through official channels. The response had been swift and decisive. Reassignment to civilian contractors, along with enhanced security briefings that made clear the consequences of discussing classified work. They bought our silence with new jobs and veiled threats, he said bitterly. Most of us were happy to go along with it. Better than ending up like the ones who didn't. The ones who didn't what? James met my eyes across the table. The ones who didn't stop asking questions. Daniel, that list of yours, I know for a fact that at least half those people were flagged for a security review before they died. He explained the process with the weary precision of someone who'd been carrying guilty knowledge for too long. Scientists or engineers who showed signs of ethical qualms about their work were subjected to enhanced psychological monitoring. Security interviews became more frequent and intensive, designed to assess not just loyalty, but psychological stability. They were looking for stress fractures, James said. People who might crack under pressure or develop consciences about what they were creating. Anyone showing signs of potential disclosure was moved to the top of a different list. The termination list. They never called it that, but yes. The targeting process was sophisticated beyond anything I'd imagined. Each individual flagged for intervention underwent covert neurological mapping during routine security reviews. The process appeared to be standard psychological evaluation, but sophisticated sensors hidden in the interview rooms recorded brainwave patterns and biosignatures unique to each subject. Once they had your neural signature, you were marked, James explained. This satellite array could find you anywhere on Earth and begin the conditioning process. Gradual at first, minor sleep disruption, increased anxiety levels, then escalating until the subject reached critical psychological instability. And then they made their choice. Some were simply monitored to ensure compliance through fear. Others, he didn't need to finish the sentence. I thought of Vimmel's final weeks, his growing paranoia and insomnia. The pattern now seemed horrifyingly clear. He'd been selected for termination, then systematically driven to psychological breakdown through electromagnetic manipulation. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. James's hands trembled as he reached for his jacket. "Because I got a call yesterday. Official-sounding voice, very polite. They wanted to schedule a routine follow-up security interview for next week." His eyes met mine with desperate clarity. "After 3 years of civilian work, they suddenly need to review my clearance status. Daniel, I'm next on the list." The implications hit me like ice water. If they were moving against James, it meant they knew about our investigation. Worse, it meant they were accelerating their timeline. "What are you going to do?" "Run. Tonight. I've got a cousin in Ireland who doesn't ask questions." He stood, but paused before leaving. "There's something else you need to know. The technology. It never worked quite right during testing." "What do you mean?" "I mean it worked too well. The psychological effects were supposed to be temporary, reversible. But we discovered that prolonged exposure created permanent neurological changes. The subjects couldn't recover even after the microwave bombardment stopped. The restaurant suddenly felt too warm, too exposed. You're saying the suicides were inevitable?" "I'm saying once they started the process, there was no way to stop it. The victims were walking dead from the moment targeting began." He pulled on his jacket with shaking hands. "They weren't just murdering people, Daniel. They were perfecting the technology on live subjects." James left cash on the table and walked away without another word. I watched him cross the car park to a battered Ford, noting how he checked his surroundings before getting in. The Ford disappeared into traffic, carrying one of the few people who could confirm what I'd discovered. I never saw James Kirkpatrick again. 2 days later, the local news reported that a man matching his description had been found dead in his flat, an apparent suicide by hanging. The report mentioned he'd been despondent about unemployment and financial difficulties, details that bore no resemblance to the frightened but determined man I'd met at the service station. The message was clear. Resistance was futile, and the program's guardians were willing to eliminate anyone who threatened exposure. That evening, sitting in my flat with the copied discs hidden behind the baseboard, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I called Sarah Chen. I have everything, I told her. Names, dates, technical specifications, proof that 27 people were murdered by their own government. When can we meet? Tomorrow. But Sarah, after this there's no going back. For either of us. Her voice was steady when she replied. Some stories are worth the risk. The Guardian's offices occupied a fortress-like building in London. Its brutalist architecture somehow appropriate for an organisation dedicated to uncovering uncomfortable truths. Sarah Chen met me in the lobby, her expression carefully neutral as she guided me through security checkpoints and into the building's depths. We worked in a windowless conference room, spreading the copied files across a table, like archaeologists examining forbidden artefacts. Sarah's expertise in investigative journalism quickly organised the chaos of documents into a coherent narrative that was even more damning than I'd realised. "This is extraordinary," she said after hours of analysis. "You've documented a systematic assassination programme operating within the British defence establishment. The implications are treasonous, revolutionary. If this is accurate, it means elements of our own government have been murdering citizens to protect classified programmes." She looked up from a technical manual describing microwave targeting protocols. "We need corroboration, independent sources who can verify the technology exists." I provided Dr. Hartwell's contact information, along with details about Margaret Thorne and other former MOD personnel who might be willing to speak off the record. Sarah's network of sources, cultivated through years of investigating government malfeasance, would provide additional verification. "How long until publication?" I asked. "Weeks, possibly months. A story this sensitive requires bulletproof sourcing and legal review. We'll need statements from multiple experts, technical analysis of the documents, and probably freedom of information requests to establish context." I understood the need for caution, but delay felt like betrayal of the victims. Every day the story remained unpublished was another day the programme could continue. Another opportunity for more names to be added to the list. What about government response? They'll try to stop publication. Sarah's smile was predatory. They can try, but once we have sufficient corroboration, this becomes a public interest story. The Official Secrets Act doesn't protect criminal conspiracies. We arranged to meet weekly to coordinate research efforts. I would continue gathering intelligence from inside Plessy, while Sarah built the external framework needed for publication. The process felt agonisingly slow, but systematic exposure was our only hope of forcing accountability. That optimism lasted exactly 4 days. I was walking to my car after work when I noticed the van parked across from the Plessy facility. Dark blue, no markings, windows tinted beyond legal limits. The same van had been in the car park when I'd arrived that morning, though in a different space. Surveillance. They knew about my investigation, but they hadn't found the hidden discs. Yet. I called Sarah from a payphone outside a pub in the next village, using code words we'd established for sensitive communications. "The holiday's cancelled," I told her, meaning the investigation was compromised. "Permanently?" "Unknown, but the travel agents are very interested in my itinerary." She understood immediately. "Can you salvage the photographs?" "The discs." "For now, but storage is becoming problematic. Meet me at the usual place tomorrow. We'll arrange alternative accommodation." I spent that night in a travel lodge, paying cash and using a false name. The paranoia that had consumed Vimal in his final weeks now seemed like rational caution rather than mental illness. Every sound in the corridor made me freeze. Every car passing the window might contain watchers. The meeting with Sarah never happened. I was driving toward London when my car suddenly lost power, engine dying without warning despite showing no mechanical problems. I managed to coast to the shoulder of the M3, where a recovery truck arrived with suspicious speed, as if someone had been monitoring my location and called for assistance before I'd even stopped. The driver was professionally helpful, diagnosing electrical failure that would require extensive repairs. He offered to tow my car to a garage in Basingstoke, but something in his manner triggered alarm bells I'd learned to trust. "I'll make other arrangements," I told him, stepping away from the truck. His smile never wavered. "Suit yourself, mate. but you might want to reconsider. It's going to be a long walk." I watched him drive away, then used the car's radio to call Sarah's emergency number. The line was dead. Not busy, not out of service, simply dead. That's when I realised the trap was closing. A black sedan pulled onto the shoulder behind my disabled car, followed by a second vehicle. Men in dark suits emerged, moving with the casual efficiency of people accustomed to cleaning up problems. I ran. The M3 motorway cuts through Hampshire countryside that still bears traces of medieval field patterns, a landscape of hedgerows and copses that provided concealment for someone desperate enough to use it. I crashed through thorn bushes and scrambled over stone walls, pursued by voices that grew more distant as I put miles between myself and the road. By nightfall, I'd reached a village whose name I never learned. The local pub provided hot food and a payphone, allowing me to contact the one person who might still be trustworthy. Margaret Thorne answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. "Daniel? They're moving against me. The story's blown." "Where are you?" I gave her the village name and pub location. "Can you help?" "Stay put. I'll make some calls." She arrived 2 hours later in a car I didn't recognise, her manner suggesting this wasn't her first experience with emergency extractions. We drove through back roads toward Wales, headlights off whenever possible while she explained the situation. "Sarah Chen is in protective custody," she said. "Special branch raided the Guardian offices this afternoon, confiscating everything related to your story under the Official Secrets Act." "What about the evidence?" "Classified, permanently sealed by D-notice." She glanced at me in the passenger seat. "The official story is that foreign agents were attempting to compromise British defence systems using disinformation and fabricated document. What happens now? Now you disappear. Permanently. New identity. New life. Somewhere far from Britain and its intelligence services." Margaret had connections cultivated during decades of MOD liaison work. People who specialised in making inconvenient individuals vanish without trace. Within 48 hours, I had passport, driving licence, and employment history for someone who'd never existed until that week. My last act as Daniel Harvers was uploading compressed copies of the files to a primitive bulletin board system, one of the early nodes of what would eventually become the Internet. The files were encrypted and hidden among routine technical discussions, but someone sufficiently motivated might eventually find them. I set the upload to post automatically in January 1995, 7 years in the future. Long enough for the immediate heat to die down, recent enough that the information might still matter. The post appeared as scheduled, buried in a Usenet newsgroup dedicated to conspiracy theories and government cover-ups. For 12 hours, it attracted the attention of researchers and amateur investigators who recognised its significance. Then it disappeared, scrubbed from servers, removed from archives, erased as if it had never existed. The Internet's memory proved as fragile as everything else when powerful interests demanded silence. But stories once told have a life of their own. They spread through whispered conversations and hand-copied documents, through the kind of human networks that predate and transcend digital communications. I've spent 30 years living under another name, in another country, doing work that has nothing to do with defence contracting or electromagnetic weapons. The man who was Daniel Havers died in 1988, along with his naive faith that truth and justice were inevitable allies. But sometimes, late at night when sleep proves elusive, I wonder if the programme ever really ended. Whether other lists exist, other names await disposition, other families will receive news of inexplicable tragedies. The technology that killed Vimal and the others was too valuable to abandon, too perfect in its untraceable lethality. Somewhere, in facilities whose names we don't know, engineers and scientists continue perfecting the art of invisible murder. Tonight, I'll be your guide on a journey into one of the coldest and most enduring mysteries of the Cold War era. I want you to picture this. It's a winter night deep in the Ural Mountains, 1959. A group of young adventurers huddles in a tent on the snowy slope of a peak ominously called Dead Mountain. They're laughing, jotting down journal entries by flashlight, and planning tomorrow's trek. They don't know it yet, but this will be their last night alive. This is the true story of the Dyatlov Pass incident, a mystery that has haunted investigators for decades. My name is James, and I've spent weeks poring over old case files, diaries, and witness reports about what happened to those 9 hikers in 1959. The more I dig, the more the Dyatlov Pass incident feels like a nightmare straddling the line between fact and fiction. So, let's delve into it together step by step as if we're investigators unravelling a case file. The story begins in late January 1959. 10 experienced ski hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on an expedition to reach a mountain called a Torten in the northern Urals. They were all in their early 20s, 7 men and 2 women, except for one older instructor, and were led by a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. On January 23, 1959, the Dyatlov group received their route book and left the city of Sverdlovsk, today's Yekaterinburg, by train. You can imagine them on that train, excited, full of youthful bravado, maybe singing along to a mandolin one of them brought for the journey. After 2 days on trains, the party reached Ivdel, a remote town at the edge of the northern Ural Mountains, which also housed a Soviet Gulag camp for criminals. From Ivdel, they travelled by bus and then hitched a ride in the back of a woodcutter's truck to a settlement called Vizhai, the last inhabited village to the north. The locals in Vizhai must have looked at these university students with a mix of admiration and concern. The route they planned to traverse was rated Category 3, the most difficult, and they were attempting it in February, the cruelest time of year. On January 27th, the Dyatlov group left Vizhai and began their trek into the wilderness. One member, Yuri Yudin, had been struggling with health issues. He had rheumatism and a congenital defect that caused knee pain. By January 28th, Yudin's joint pain became too severe. Reluctantly, he turned back toward Vizhai, unable to continue. He had no idea that by saving himself, he was sealing his fate as the expedition's sole survivor. Yuri Yudin would never see his friends alive again. The remaining 9 hikers pressed on into the wild, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Through diaries and photographs recovered later, investigators have pieced together their route. By January 31st, the group had reached the edge of a highland area and cached surplus food and equipment in a wooded valley to be used for the return trip. They joked around, took photos, and even made a little mock newspaper they titled The Evening Autoten, in which one entry humorously proclaimed, "From now on, we know that the snowmen exist," likely a tongue-in-cheek reference to local Yeti legends. Despite the exhaustion and cold, their spirits were high. On February 1st, the team started to move through a mountain pass, later named Dyatlov Pass after this incident, with the plan to camp on the other side that night. But the weather turned on them. A howling snowstorm and blinding wind caused Dyatlov's team to lose their direction on the barren slopes. Instead of crossing the pass into the shelter of the valley beyond, they had veered west, finding themselves on the flank of a mountain called Kholat Shakal, which in the local Mansi language means Dead Mountain. By the time they realised their mistake, it was late in the day, and visibility was near zero from the blowing snow. Rather than descend 1.5 kilometres down into the forest for cover, Igor Dyatlov decided to pitch their tent right there on the mountainside in the open. Perhaps he didn't want to lose the altitude they'd gained, or perhaps he wanted to prove they could handle camping on an exposed slope in a blizzard. The 9 of them set up their large tent on the bare snow, chopping into the slope for a flat spot. It was a decision that would be heavily scrutinised later. That evening of February 1st, 1959 must have been brutal. Temperatures were around minus 20 degrees Celsius, and winds roared over the pass. Still, inside the tent, the group was relatively secure. They had a warm dinner. Later forensic analysis of their stomach contents showed they ate around 6 to 7 p.m. In one of the last photos recovered from their cameras, they are seen joking and smiling as they set up camp in the twilight on February 1st. Despite the extreme cold and howling wind outside, they seemed in good spirits, jotting down journal entries and chatting as they settled in for the night. They could not have imagined the terror that was coming. Something happened in the dark early hours of February 2nd that changed everything. We don't have eyewitnesses to describe it. All we have is the evidence left behind, and that evidence reads like the opening scene of a horror film. Sometime after midnight, the tent was suddenly slashed open from the inside. The 9 campers, who had been sleeping or resting, burst out of their tent into a howling snowstorm in the pitch black of night. They left behind almost all their gear, boots, coats, hats, sleeping bags, axes, as if fleeing an imminent threat. Imagine the situation. It's minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, outside, and yet something scared or startled them so badly that they ran out half-dressed and barefoot into the blizzard. Why? What could have terrified them, or otherwise compelled them to abandon their only shelter and run into certain death? That's the question investigators have grappled with for over 60 years. When the group failed to return to Vizhai by February 12th as planned, there wasn't immediate alarm. Delays of a few days were common for such expeditions. But as day after day passed with no word, the hikers' families grew anxious. By February 20th, the relatives demanded a search and rescue operation. The Ural Polytechnic Institute sent student volunteers to scour the route, and soon the Soviet army and local militia police joined in, with planes and helicopters dispatched to aid the search. Rescuers faced brutal weather themselves, traversing deep snow and scanning miles of desolate terrain. Among the searchers was a student named Mikhail Sharavin, who on February 26th would make a chilling discovery. On February 26th, 1959, Sharavin's search team was moving along the slopes of Kolatchakal when he spotted something odd sticking out of the snow. As they got closer, they realised it was a corner of the missing group's tent, collapsed and half buried in the snow. Sharavin used an ice pick to hack open the tent's entrance, which was blocked with snow. The sight inside the tent baffled him. The tent's canvas had been slashed open from the inside with a knife, and although it was damaged and partially snow-filled, almost all the hikers' belongings were still neatly arranged inside. He found blankets and coats laid out, a row of boots, axes and flashlights set to the sides, a map and official papers, a little pile of money and even a flask of alcohol. In one corner was a plate with slices of sayalo, pork fat, as if someone had been in the middle of fixing a snack. It was like a snapshot frozen in time. The tent felt orderly, not like it had been ripped apart by an external force. Sharavin later said it was as if the campers had been interrupted in the middle of dinner, then fled in a rush. The scene sent shivers down his spine. Why would experienced hikers cut open their only shelter and run away without boots or coats? Outside the tent, the search team found footprints in the snow, and they only deepened the mystery. There were 9 sets of prints, which matched the number of missing hikers. They could see the impressions of feet wearing only socks, or a single shoe, and some barefoot. You could even make out toe marks in the frozen snow. The tracks indicated that the hikers had not run in a wild panic, but rather walked fast or at a hurried shuffle down the slope, in an organised single file. The rescuers followed these tracks downhill in the direction of a dense forest. Incredibly, the footprints continued for about 500 metres before they were obscured by fresh snow. It was as if the group had intentionally headed toward the forest, perhaps seeking shelter or regrouping. Sharavin and the others were utterly perplexed. What on earth could have made these seasoned hikers leave their tent in sub-zero cold, partially dressed and even barefoot, walking away calmly into the night? With dusk approaching on February 26th, the searchers had to pause the search until morning, haunted by the enigma they'd uncovered. The next day, the search parties fanned out from the tent down toward the forest. At the forest's edge, under a large Siberian cedar tree, Sharavin and his comrades found the charred remains of a small fire. Near that fire lay the first 2 bodies. What they saw defied explanation. Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy, Yuri Krivonishenko, were found side by side in the snow, shoeless and dressed only in their underwear. The branches on the cedar above them were broken up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed up into the tree. Indeed, bits of skin and torn clothing were found on the bark. It looked like one of them had frantically clambered up the cedar, either to get a better view of the area, perhaps trying to spot the tent in the dark, or to escape something. Krivonishenko's corpse had burns on parts of his body, and in a grim detail he had a piece of flesh missing from his right hand. It turned out he had bitten off a chunk of his own knuckle, possibly in an attempt to stay conscious or stifle a scream while dying of cold. Both men's hands and feet were deep reddish-brown, a sign of frostbite, and maybe the last attempt to warm their limbs by the fire. The tree's branches had been stripped for kindling, but the fire they managed to build was small and had burned out by the time they died. The image of these two friends huddled by a dead fire, slowly freezing to death in their underwear under a sky of endless black, is something I can't easily shake off. About 300 meters away from the cedar tree, toward the tent, the searchers found the body of Igor Dyatlov. He was lying face up in the snow, head oriented toward the tent up the slope, as if he had been trying to crawl back that way. Dyatlov was better dressed than the two under the tree. He wore a flannel shirt, a sweater, and pants, but notably, he had no coat and no boots, only socks on his feet. One arm was frozen upright, reaching toward the sky, clutching a small birch branch. His other hand was pressed to his chest. People who saw his body remarked that he appeared to be protecting something in his jacket or close to his heart. Perhaps a photograph or his notebook, though nothing of note was found on his chest. His face, when they cleared the snow, was strangely calm, eyes open. Not far from Dyatlov, searchers found Zinaida Zina Kolmogorova, the 22-year-old female student in the group. Zina was better dressed than Igor. She had on 2 sweaters and 2 pants, but she too lacked boots, wearing only socks. Her body was turned toward the tent and her arms were extended forward, bent at the elbows, as if she had been crawling uphill on her stomach, desperately trying to get back to the tent before the cold overtook her. On Zina's right side, the searchers noted a long, bright red bruise running along her torso, resembling a blunt force injury from a baton or the butt of a rifle. It was an odd injury to see, given that she had no other major external wounds. It took a few more days until March 5th to find Rustem Slobodin, the last of these first 5 bodies. Slobodin, 23, was discovered face down in the snow about 480 meters from the cedar, roughly halfway back toward the tent. He was dressed more warmly than the others. He had a long-sleeve undershirt, a sweater, 2 pairs of pants, 4 pairs of socks, and 1 felt-lined boot on his right foot, but his head was bare and his left foot was only in a sock. In his right hand, Slobodin clenched a small pocket knife, closed. An autopsy would later reveal that Slobodin had a fracture in his skull, about 7 inches long, consistent with a blunt impact. However, this crack in his skull was not deemed a fatal wound. The medical examiner thought Rustem could have sustained it during a fall and continued moving for at least an hour afterward. Like Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, Rustem Slobodin ultimately died of hypothermia. In fact, the first 5 bodies found all had no life-threatening external injuries. They had perished from the unforgiving cold. Slobodin's watch was found shattered and stopped at 8:45, though it's unclear if that was 8:45 a.m. or p.m, or even 8:45 on a different date. It was as if time itself froze at that moment. Now imagine being Yuri Yudin, the one who had turned back, called in to identify the bodies of your friends. One by one, the first 5 corpses were airlifted to the morgue in Ivdel for autopsy and identification. Yudin, with a heavy heart, confirmed their identities. But 4 members of the Dyatlov party were still missing. Weeks passed with no sign of them. The winter snows began to melt under the early spring sun. It wasn't until May, nearly 3 months later, that nature revealed the remaining victims, turning the mystery into something even more haunting. On May 4th, a Mansi tribesman named Kurin and his dog were assisting the search, when the dog picked up a scent near a rocky ravine further into the woods from the cedar tree. About 75 meters beyond the cedar and 1,500 meters from the tent, in a snow-filled ravine, searchers discovered a few torn pieces of clothing on a branch. Digging down, they uncovered the final 4 bodies buried under nearly 4 meters of snow. These were Lyudmila, Lyuda Dubinina, Semyon, Alexander, Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibaut Brignol, and Alexander Kolevatov. They were lying about 75 meters further into the forest from the cedar, at the bottom of that ravine. Notably, 3 of the 4 were better dressed than the others, and it appeared they had taken clothes from those who died earlier. Dubinina, for example, was found wearing Krivonishenko's torn and burned brown trousers, and her foot was wrapped in a piece of his wool sweater. Zolotaryov, the 38-year-old, was found wearing Dubinina's faux fur coat and hat. Kolevatov had put on a spare sweater and pants, likely from one of the others. This exchange of clothing suggests that when some members of the group died, the last survivors stripped the dead of usable clothing to keep themselves alive, a tragic but practical act of survival. But the condition of these 4 bodies deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Unlike the first 5, 3 of these 4 had fatal physical injuries that were utterly horrifying. Nikolai Thibaut Brignol had suffered a massive skull fracture. His skull was literally crushed, the fracture measuring about 8 inches. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov both had their chests caved in, with multiple ribs broken on each side. Dubinina had 10 ribs fractured, and Zolotaryov had 5 ribs fractured. A forensic doctor who examined the bodies said that the force required to produce such injuries would have been extremely high, comparable to that of a car crash. In other words, something had delivered an immense pressure or impact to their bodies. Strangely, none of these 3 had any external wounds or bruises corresponding to the lethal internal damage. It was as if they'd been hit by a shockwave or squeezed by a tremendous force without breaking the skin. The 4th person in the ravine, Alexander Kolevatov, had a less clear cause of death. He had a broken nose, an open wound behind his ear, and a deformed neck, but his injuries were not as catastrophic as the others. It's believed Kolevatov also died of hypothermia, possibly after sustaining some trauma. And then there were the gruesome details that truly made this case infamous. All 4 of these people in the ravine had some form of soft tissue damage to the head and face that wasn't seen in the others. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips, and even a bit of her skull bone. Semyon Zolotaryov was missing his eyeballs, and Alexander Kolevatov was missing his eyebrows. These shocking injuries naturally gave rise to lurid theories. Was the group attacked by someone or something that ripped out tongues and eyes? However, the medical experts had a more mundane explanation. The 4 in the ravine were found in a stream bed. During the 3 months before they were found, water and scavenging animals likely caused the soft tissue of their faces to decompose or be eaten away. In Dubinina's case, the autopsy noted that her stomach contained about 100 grams of coagulated blood, suggesting her heart was still beating when her tongue was removed, meaning the tongue likely decomposed or was scavenged very soon after her death. As horrifying as these injuries sound, investigators believe they were post-mortem effects, not violence inflicted while alive. Still, when these details became public, they fueled wild speculation about murderous attackers or supernatural evil. It didn't help that Zolotaryov was found with a camera around his neck, different from the other cameras found in the tent, and his hand holding a pen and notepad, as if he died trying to write something down. Unfortunately, whatever he intended to note was never written. The pad was blank. The investigators in 1959 were at a loss to come up with a satisfying explanation for all this. A criminal inquest began as a matter of procedure, since several of the deaths involved injuries. They first suspected that the native Manatee people, reindeer herders of the region, might have attacked the campers for trespassing on sacred land. But that theory was quickly dispelled. The only footprints found at the scene were those of the hikers themselves, and there were no signs of hand-to-hand struggle on the bodies. In fact, the Mansi had helped in the search, and had no history of hostile encounters with hikers. Next, investigators considered an avalanche, but the pattern of the tent and the footprints suggested otherwise. We'll revisit that later. As for animal attack, no large animal tracks were found, and the violent injuries didn't have the telltale marks of claws or teeth. The Soviet authorities were left to conclude that no other humans were involved in the Dyatlov group's demise. One of the doctors famously commented that the force which killed Dubinina and Zolotaryov was more than any human could inflict. No human could be powerful enough to cause such damage. One piece of information emerged that added a strange Cold War twist. When the forensic analysts tested the hikers' clothing, they found unusual levels of radiation on some of the garments. Specifically, Dubinina's brown sweater and Krivonishenko's wool pants were found to be radioactive. This discovery didn't make sense in a hiking context, and was not something the average person could detect. It was only found because one investigator had access to a Geiger counter. The presence of radiation fueled speculation that the Dyatlov party had encountered some secret weapon or radioactive fallout. However, a closer look provided a more ordinary explanation. Yuri Krivonishenko had previously worked at the Mazak nuclear facility and was involved in cleaning up a major nuclear accident in 1957, the Kishtim disaster. It's very possible his clothes were contaminated from that event and still carried traces of radiation. Likewise, Alexander Kolevatov had studied nuclear physics and worked at a secret institute in Moscow, which might explain contamination on some items. In short, the radiation might not have had anything to do with the incident. It could have been a red herring. Still, the fact that their skin reportedly had a deep tan, and some of their hair had turned grey when relatives saw the bodies, only intensified rumours of some nuclear or chemical exposure. Authorities claimed the skin tanning was a natural mummification effect from lying in the sun and cold for weeks, and that hair can turn colour from exposure or the embalming process. But to grieving families in 1959, radioactive clothes and orange skin sounded like the stuff of government cover-ups and sci-fi nightmares. By May 1959, the official investigation was drawing to a close without a concrete answer. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, was under pressure to wrap it up. In his final report, Ivanov wrote that the hikers died because of the effect of an unknown compelling force. It was a vague catch-all phrase, essentially admitting that they couldn't figure it out. No external culprits could be identified, and the case was therefore closed without any criminal charges. The files were stamped secret and filed away in a Soviet archive. The Dyatlov Pass area was also declared off-limits to other expeditions for the next 3 years, supposedly to prevent any more tragedies, though some see it as an attempt to keep curious eyes away. The inquest's official finding was that the group members died due to a compelling natural force, a phrase that raised more questions than it answered. Imagine the weight of that silence. 9 young lives lost, and their families were told they would never know exactly how or why. In the Soviet Union of 1959, that was that. Some of the parents and siblings sensed a cover-up. Zina Kolmogoreva's mother, for instance, and Igor Dyatlov's parents all received hushed warnings from officials. The families were explicitly told, "You will never know the truth, so stop asking questions." In those days, if the party or KGB told you to be quiet, you stayed quiet, out of fear. So the families buried their children without knowing what really happened, and the Dyatlov incident faded into an eerie Cold War legend whispered about in Ural classrooms and mountaineering clubs. As for Yuri Yudin, the sole survivor who wasn't even there, he lived the rest of his life with survivor's guilt and a burning desire to find the truth. Yudin repeatedly insisted that his friends did not die due to some simple natural accident. He felt in his gut that something else, something man-made, had to have caused it. In interviews before his death in 2013, Yuri Yudin openly voiced his belief that the Soviet authorities knew more than they let on about the incident. In fact, not long before he died, Yudin publicly stated that he believed his teammates had been taken out of the tent at gunpoint and murdered. He even speculated that Dubinina's tongue was cut out by perpetrators because she was the most outspoken of the group. These are incredibly serious accusations, and they were never proven. Yudin admitted he had no evidence, just deep suspicions after a lifetime of thinking about it. Whether Yudin was right or wrong, his perspective shows just how deeply the Dyatlov mystery can burrow into someone's soul, so here we are decades later with more questions than answers. I'm a modern-day investigator, combing through the remnants of old reports and new theories. As I piece together each bit of evidence, I feel that cold wind from Dead Mountain blowing through the decades. The Dyatlov Pass incident has become one of the world's most enduring mysteries, precisely because it sits at the crossroads of the explicable and the baffling. Over the years, numerous theories have been put forward to explain it, some grounded in scientific reasoning, others veering into the paranormal or conspiratorial. Let's examine these theories one by one, like branching investigative paths, and see where each leads. Keep in mind, any good explanation must account for all the odd details we've discussed: the torn tent, the state of undress, the bizarre injuries, the radiation, the reports of strange lights in the sky, the secrecy. It's a tall order, but let's walk these paths together. The first path is the one that the Russian authorities themselves eventually settled on: an avalanche. For many, this is the most straightforward explanation. Picture the scenario. The Dyatlov group is asleep in their tent on the slope, when suddenly a slab of heavy snow above them fractures and slides down onto the tent. The tent fabric begins to collapse and they hear the roar of snow. In a flash, the group panics. They believe a full avalanche is about to bury them. In seconds, they grab a knife, slash open the tent from the inside, because the entrance is blocked or hard to open under the weight of snow, and they flee into the night wearing whatever they had on at that moment. This theory gained significant traction, and in fact in 2019 to 2020 the Russian government reinvestigated Dyatlov Pass and concluded that a slab avalanche was the official cause of death. Later that year, a team of scientists published new computer simulations supporting the plausibility of an avalanche. In this case, the most appealing aspect of the avalanche theory is that the hiker's actions no longer seem irrational under this lens. If you believe an avalanche is about to crush you, doing whatever it takes to get out of the tent and moving to safer ground is exactly the right response. And indeed, everything the Dyatlov group did after leaving the tent can be seen as textbook survival behaviour once you assume an avalanche threat. The theory goes like this. A slab of snow, perhaps loosened by the wind or the heat from their stove earlier, slid and partially buried the tent, making loud cracks and rumbles. The experienced hikers immediately and calmly initiated an emergency evacuation. They cut their way out of the tent and headed for ground that would be safe from a larger avalanche, which in this case meant moving toward the tree line on the far side of the pass. They didn't take time to put on boots or grab equipment because every second mattered. In their minds, they had to get clear of the avalanche path. In just their socks and light clothes, they made it about a mile downslope to the forest. There they regrouped and tried to stay warm by building a fire. We saw evidence of that by the cedar. They also dug a snow cave as a shelter. The ravine where the last four were found had branches laid out on the floor, signs Hello there, fellow truth seekers and story lovers. How's your day going? What time is it where you are in the world right now? Whether you're listening from Tokyo at sunrise, London during lunch, or Los Angeles as the sun sets, I hope you're ready for a story that might make you look at the world a little differently. Before we dive into tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe to Sleep Theories for more stories that blur the line between fiction and the secrets that might be hiding in plain sight. Now let's begin. My name is Elliot Vale, and until 3 weeks ago I believed I was living the American dream. 16 years old, valedictorian track at Georgetown Prep, National Merit Scholar, captain of the debate team. My college applications were perfect, my future was mapped out, and my father was proud of me. At least I thought he was my father. I should have known something was wrong earlier. The signs were there, scattered like breadcrumbs through our sterile suburban life in McLean, Virginia. But when you're drowning in AP coursework and college prep, when your biggest worry is whether Harvard will accept your early admission application, you don't stop to analyse why your dad has started watching the same news clips over and over again with the sound turned off. Dr. Adam Vale, my father, as I knew him then, worked for what he called military biomedical research. He had top secret clearance, the kind that meant I couldn't even know which building he worked in. His badge stayed locked in a small titanium case by the front door, and he'd set 3 different alarms to make sure he never forgot it. The man who raised me was methodical, brilliant, and increasingly distant as the months wore on. "Just work stress, Elliot," he'd say when I asked why he seemed so tired, why he'd stopped smiling at my academic achievements, why he'd installed new security cameras around our house. Nothing for you to worry about. But I was born to worry. It's what made me good at everything. That constant analysis, that need to understand every variable in the equation. And my father had become the most complex equation in my life. The high-security cars started showing up around September. Black SUVs with tinted windows that would idle in our driveway, while my father gathered his things. Sometimes men in dark suits would come to the door, never giving names, just nodding at me politely before disappearing into my father's study for hours of hushed conversation. I'd try to listen from the hallway, but they must have installed some kind of white noise system because all I could hear was static. Then there were the phone calls, always late at night, always answered on the first ring. My father would speak in clipped, professional tones about subjects and iterations and behavioural matrices. Medical terminology, I assumed, but it never quite sounded like the kind of research he'd described to me before. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in October. I was working on my MIT application essay in the living room when my father came home early, which never happened. He walked straight to the television and pulled up a news clip from earlier that day, some celebrity having what looked like a nervous breakdown during a late-night talk show appearance. The singer kept repeating, "This isn't right, this isn't right," before being quickly escorted off stage. My father watched this clip 17 times. I counted. He used to smile when he was proud of me, when I brought home another perfect test score or academic award. He used to ruffle my hair and call me his little genius. But as I watched him stare at that screen, watching a stranger's mental breakdown on an endless loop, I realised he hadn't smiled at me in months. He used to be my father, but something had changed, and I was going to find out what. That night, after he'd gone to bed, I made a decision that would shatter everything I thought I knew about the world. 3 days of planning, that's all it took to clone my father's security badge. I'd been studying his routine for weeks, noting how he handled the titanium case, memorising the angles at which he held the badge when the scanner read it. During lunch at school, I used the 3D printing lab to create a replica casing. After school, I worked in our garage with an NFC scanner I'd built from Arduino components and online tutorials. The hardest part was getting close enough to the original badge to copy its digital signature, but my father's new habit of working late into the night in his study gave me the opportunity I needed. On Friday night, while he was locked away with another of his mysterious phone calls, I used a small mirror to reflect the badge's NFC chip toward my scanner through the crack under his study door. It took 47 minutes and 6 attempts, but I got a clean copy. The facility was a 20-minute bike ride from our house, tucked away in an industrial complex that looked abandoned from the outside. No signs, no markings, just a concrete building with narrow windows and loading docks that never seemed to have any trucks. I'd driven past it dozens of times with my father over the years, and he'd never so much as glanced in its direction. The perfect cover. At 11:30 p.m, I approached the side entrance with my cloned badge and held my breath. The scanner beeped green, and the heavy steel door clicked open. Inside was nothing like what I'd expected from a medical research facility. The hallways were too narrow, the lighting too dim and red-tinted. Everything hummed. The walls, the floor, even the air seemed to vibrate with the sound of massive machinery somewhere deeper in the building. It felt more like a submarine than a laboratory. I followed signs marked with room numbers and security classifications I didn't recognise. Most doors required additional clearance beyond what my father's badge could provide, but I eventually found an elevator that accepted my access level. The button panel showed floors B1 through B4, with B4 marked Nucleus Restricted Access. The elevator descended much farther than 4 floors should have taken it. B4 was different, colder. The red lighting was replaced with harsh white fluorescence that made everything look sterile and surgical. The humming was louder here, and I could smell something chemical and antiseptic that reminded me of the morgue tour we'd taken in my forensics class. I found an active terminal in what looked like a monitoring station. Banks of screens showed biometric data, security feeds, and file directories with names that made my stomach turn. The computer was logged into my father's account. Dr. Adam Vale, Project Lead, Department of Advanced Human Studies. The files were organised into categories that read like something from a science fiction horror movie. Rendition units, active global deployment, behavioural replacement models, batch 1 to 15, memory integration protocols, success, failure rates, copy error protocol, emergency extraction procedures. And then I saw the individual files named with a format that made my blood freeze. Kanye, active, Biden, 3, compromised. Cardi B, 2, replaced. Bezos, 7, pending swift. Terminated. Each file contained detailed psychological profiles, biometric data, and something called iteration notes that documented changes made between versions. Kanye Biasev was noted as more compliant than Kanye's 4, but occasional glitching in unscripted environments. Biden 3 was marked compromised due to memory cascade failure, schedule termination. At the bottom of the directory was a folder labelled Vale Adam Original Archived. My hands were shaking as I clicked on it. Inside was everything. Medical scans, psychological profiles, memory mapping data, and a video file labelled Final Recording Before Replacement. I couldn't bring myself to click play, not yet. Not until I saw what was in Chamber 4. Chamber 4 was behind 2 additional security doors that my father's access barely covered. By the time I reached it, my heart was beating so hard I was sure it would trigger some kind of biometric alarm. But the facility seemed to be operating on minimal night staffing, and most of the security appeared to be automated. The chamber was vast, much larger than the narrow hallways had suggested possible. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, and along the walls were rows upon rows of cylindrical tanks, each about the size of a phone booth filled with a clear viscous fluid. And floating in each tank was a human being. They were all naked, all suspended by breathing apparatus and feeding tubes, all completely motionless, and they were all people I recognised. The first tank I approached held someone who looked exactly like the pop star who'd been in the news the week before for erratic behaviour at a concert. The label on the tank read, Unit 4 on reserve. Next to it was another tank with an identical figure, labelled Unit 1-active- currently deployed. A third tank was marked Unit 3, compromised, terminated, and was empty except for residual fluid. I walked down the rows, seeing faces from television, from politics, from social media. Every celebrity who'd had a breakdown or a change of heart, or a new outlook on life after a stint in rehab or a mysterious disappearance was here. Multiple versions of each, some labelled as active, others as reserves, still others as terminated. The technology was incredible and horrifying. Each tank had its own life support system. its own computer interface showing brainwave patterns and vital signs. Some of the tanks had screens displaying what looked like memory upload progress, files being written directly into the suspended person's brain. But it was the tank at the end of the row that made me fall to my knees. Dr. Adam Vale, my father, floating unconscious in the thick fluid, breathing apparatus covering his face, feeding tubes snaking into his arms. The label on his tank read, "Original Archived, Do Not Terminate." Below that, in smaller text, Vale Fair 1 currently active, home assignment, Vale Fair 2 on reserve. I stared at the face of the man who'd raised me, who'd helped me with my homework, who'd taught me to drive, who'd been proud of my accomplishments. The real him was here, unconscious, stored like a spare part. The man living in my house, the man I'd called Dad for months, was a copy, a replacement, an iteration. And somewhere in this facility was Vale 2, a backup in case the current version malfunctioned or was compromised. I pressed my hand against the glass of my father's tank, and for just a moment, I thought I saw his eyes flutter. Like some part of him, deep in whatever chemically induced coma they were keeping him in, knew I was there. That's when the alarm started. The sound was deafening, a pulsing klaxon that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Red lights began flashing, and automated systems activated throughout the chamber. The tanks began cycling through some kind of diagnostic sequence, and I could hear heavy security doors slamming shut throughout the facility. A computerized voice echoed through speakers I couldn't see. Unauthorized access detected in sub-level 4. Implementing containment protocol. All personnel report to stations immediately. I ran toward the exit, but the door I'd entered through was sealed, a red light blinking where the green scanner had been. Emergency lighting had activated, casting everything in hellish red shadows that made the floating figures in the tanks look even more nightmarish. There had to be another way out. I'd studied enough building schematics for my engineering classes to know that facilities like this always had emergency exits, service tunnels, something. I just had to stay calm and think logically. The ventilation system, large enough for maintenance access, and it wouldn't be affected by the security lockdown. I found a maintenance panel near the monitoring station and used the multi-tool from my backpack to remove the screws. The vent opening was tight, but I'd always been small for my age. I grabbed as many printed files as I could carry from the terminal, evidence, proof of what I'd seen, and stuffed them into my backpack before crawling into the ventilation shaft. The crawl through the facility's ductwork was a nightmare of sharp metal edges and stifling heat. I could hear security teams moving through the building below me, their radio chatter echoing up through the vents. They were conducting a floor-by-floor search, but they seemed to be working under the assumption that the intruder was still in the lower levels. It took me nearly an hour to find an exit vent that led to the building's exterior. By the time I dropped down into the alley behind the facility, it was almost 3 a.m. I was exhausted, scratched up and completely disoriented, but I was free. That's when I saw the black SUVs parked outside my house. 4 of them, lined up along our quiet suburban street like some kind of motorcade. Men in dark suits stood by each vehicle, and I could see the glow of electronic devices, tablets, phones, communication equipment. They weren't trying to be subtle, they wanted me to know they were there. I hid behind a neighbour's fence and watched as one of the men approached our front door. He didn't knock, he used a key. A moment later, the man I'd known as my father appeared in the doorway. Even from a distance, I could see him clearly in the porch light, and he looked exactly the same as always. But now I knew the truth. This wasn't my father having a bad day or dealing with work stress. This was Vale 1, a programmable copy, reporting to his handlers. They spoke for several minutes, the copy nodding and gesturing toward my bedroom window. Then the suited man handed him something, looked like a tablet or a phone, and got back into one of the SUVs. As the vehicles drove away, Vale 1 stood in our doorway for a long moment, staring directly at the spot where I was hiding. Even from that distance, even in the dim streetlight, I could see that his expression was completely emotionless. He wasn't worried about me. He wasn't concerned about his missing son. He was waiting for his next set of instructions, That's when I realised they'd known I was in the facility before I'd even left. The security breach hadn't been an accident or a delayed response to my presence. They'd been tracking me from the moment I'd used the clone badge, maybe even from the moment I'd first copied it. This was all part of some larger plan, and I was running out of time to figure out what it was. I couldn't go home. I couldn't call the police. What was I going to tell them? That my father had been replaced by a clone, and there was a secret government facility growing copies of celebrities and tanks. They'd think I was having some kind of psychotic break. There was only one person I could think of who might believe me, or at least listen long enough for me to show her the evidence. Mrs. Chen, my AP biology teacher. She'd worked for defence contractors before becoming a teacher, and she'd always been willing to discuss conspiracy theories and government overreach with students who were interested. More importantly, she'd always taken me seriously, even when my questions got a little too intense for most adults. I made it to her house just as the sun was coming up, exhausted and paranoid and probably looking like I'd been crawling through ventilation shafts for hours, which I had. She opened the door in her bathrobe, took one look at me, and immediately let me inside. "Elliot, what happened to you? Should I call your father?" "No!" The word came out more forcefully than I'd intended. "Please, Mrs. Chen, I need you to listen to me. I need you to look at something, and I need you to promise me you won't call anyone until you've seen it." She studied my face for a long moment, and I could see her switching from concerned teacher mode to the analytical mindset that had made her such a good scientist. "Show me what you've got." I spread the printed files across her dining room table. Psychological profiles, medical specifications, memory integration protocols, and photographs from the tanks. Everything I'd been able to grab before escaping through the vents. Mrs. Chen examined each document carefully, and I watched her expression change from skepticism to confusion to something approaching horror. When she got to the photos I'd managed to take with my phone, blurry but unmistakable images of the floating figures in Chamber 4, she sat down heavily in one of her chairs. "Jesus Christ, Elliot, where did you get these? You believe me?" She was quiet for a long time, flipping through the documents again. "I've heard rumours," she said finally. "When I worked for Raytheon, there were always stories about black projects, about research that went beyond what anyone was supposed to be doing. But I thought they were just stories. What kind of stories? Memory manipulation, consciousness transfer, projects that were supposedly shut down in the 70s after the Church Committee investigations, but..." She held up one of the psychological profiles. "But this technology, this level of detail about neural mapping and behavioural modification, this is decades beyond anything that should exist." We spent the morning going through everything I'd found, and Mrs. Chen helped me understand some of the technical specifications I'd missed. The clones weren't just physical copies. They were being programmed with modified versions of the original person's memories and personality. The psychological profiles included detailed notes about which traits to enhance or suppress in each iteration. "They're not just replacing people," Mrs. Chen said, studying a file labelled Behavioural Modification Protocols. "They're improving them, making them more compliant, more predictable. Look at this." She showed me a comparison chart between different iterations of the same person. Each version had been adjusted, less prone to addiction, more willing to follow scripts, reduced capacity for independent thought. They were creating perfect puppets who looked and mostly acted like the originals, but without any of the unpredictability that made them human. "We have to expose this," I said. "We have to tell people." "With what proof?" "These documents could be faked. The photos are too blurry to be definitive. And even if we had perfect evidence, who would we tell? If this project is real, if it's as extensive as these files suggest, then the people who would normally investigate something like this are probably already compromised." That's when we saw the news report. Mrs. Chen had left the television on in the background, tuned to a local news station. We both looked up when we heard the anchor mention a disturbing incident during a live broadcast the night before. The footage showed a young pop star, someone I'd seen in one of the tanks just hours earlier, having what looked like a complete breakdown during a late-night talk show appearance. But this wasn't like the usual celebrity meltdown. The singer kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "I'm not supposed to remember this. I'm not supposed to remember. I'm not me. I'm not me." Security guards had rushed onto the set and physically carried her away while she kept screaming. The show had cut to commercial, and by morning, the official story was that she'd had an adverse reaction to medication and was seeking treatment at a private facility. Memory cascade failure, Mrs. Chen said quietly, reading from one of the files, is listed here as one of the potential complications. Sometimes the original memories break through the programming. That's when I realised we weren't just dealing with a conspiracy to replace public figures. We were dealing with a system that was already failing, copies that were breaking down and glitching in public. And if the people running this project were willing to replace celebrities and politicians, what would they do to a 16-year-old who'd discovered their secret? I got my answer that evening. I was staying in Mrs. Chen's guest room trying to figure out our next move when I heard her gasp from the living room. I came out to find her standing at the window, her face pale. "Elliot," she said quietly, "you need to see this." Across the street, standing under a streetlight, was a figure I recognised immediately. Same height as me, same build, same face. But this version of me was standing perfectly still, staring directly at Mrs. Chen's house with an expression I'd never seen on my own face, completely emotionless and somehow predatory. They hadn't just replaced my father, they'd built a version of me, and it was watching, waiting for the right moment to complete whatever mission it had been programmed to carry out. "How long do you think we have?" Mrs. Chen asked. I watched my own face staring back at me from across the street, and I realised that everything I'd thought I knew about my life, about my family, about myself, had been carefully constructed by people who saw human beings as nothing more than biological machines to be improved, modified, and replaced. "Not long enough," I said. We had maybe 6 hours before they made their move. The copy of me had disappeared sometime after midnight, but we both knew it would be back. Mrs. Chen had helped me understand enough of the technical documentation to realise that the copies weren't just physically identical. They had access to modified versions of their original's memories. My copy would know how I thought, how I behaved, how I would try to escape. But it wouldn't know everything. The real me had been living with increasing suspicion about my father for months, learning to hide my thoughts and observations. The real me had developed skills and knowledge that wouldn't be included in whatever psychological profile they'd built their copy from. The real me had become paranoid, and paranoia was about to save my life. Mrs. Chen had contacts in the academic world, people who specialised in government transparency and whistleblowing. But every conventional channel we could think of had the same problem. If this conspiracy was as extensive as the file suggested, we had no way of knowing who might already be compromised. "Dark web," I said, remembering something from my computer science classes. "Anonymous file sharing, distributed through multiple servers, impossible to trace back to us." "You know how to do that?" "I can figure it out. It took me 3 hours to set up the anonymous accounts, encrypted file transfers, and distributed hosting that would make our leak untraceable." Mrs. Chen helped me organise the documents, and we created a comprehensive package that included all the files I'd taken from the facility, the photographs of the tanks, and a detailed written account of everything I'd discovered. We uploaded everything to 6 different platforms simultaneously: WikiLeaks, several investigative journalism sites, academic transparency organisations, and a handful of conspiracy theory forums that had enough credibility to get mainstream attention if something big enough landed in their laps. Then we waited. The first responses came within an hour. Journalists started reaching out through the anonymous channels we'd set up, asking for verification, for additional evidence, for ways to contact us directly. Several of the conspiracy forums had already begun analysing our documents, comparing them with other leaks and rumours they'd been tracking. By dawn, our story was trending on social media. Project Reflection began spreading across Twitter and TikTok, with thousands of people sharing the documents and debating their authenticity. Several major news outlets picked up the story, though most were treating it as an elaborate hoax rather than a genuine leak. That's when things got interesting. At 7 a.m, every major news network simultaneously received what they described as comprehensive evidence that our documents were sophisticated fakes created by foreign intelligence agencies to destabilize American democracy. Government officials appeared on morning shows to denounce the leak as obvious disinformation, and to praise the speed with which their cybersecurity experts had identified the forgeries. By noon, the story had been completely flipped. Instead of exposing a conspiracy, we'd supposedly fallen victim to one. The documents were being analysed by independent experts who found evidence of digital manipulation. The photographs were dismissed as CGI. Even the video footage people had started connecting to our claims, celebrities glitching during public appearances, was being explained as coordinated deepfake attacks designed to make Americans distrust their own government and media. It was masterfully done. Instead of denying the existence of the conspiracy, they'd made us part of a different conspiracy. We weren't whistleblowers exposing the truth. We were useful idiots spreading foreign propaganda. But something interesting had happened in those first few hours before the narrative got flipped. People had downloaded and shared our files faster than they could be scrubbed. Screenshots, mirror sites, and backup copies were scattered across the internet. And while most people were accepting the official explanation, a significant number were asking the right questions. Mrs. Chen found me that afternoon staring at my laptop, watching the news coverage with a mixture of frustration and fascination. "They're good at this," she said. "Too good. Look at this response time, the coordination between different agencies and media outlets. You can't organise something this comprehensive in a few hours unless you've already planned for it. Which means they've had to do this before." I was about to respond when I heard the sound I'd been dreading, a knock at the front door. Not the aggressive pounding of law enforcement, but a polite, almost friendly knock. The kind of knock a neighbour might make, or a delivery person, or someone who looked exactly like me. Mrs. Chen and I looked at each other, and I could see the same realisation in her eyes that I was feeling. We'd done what we could. We'd gotten the information out there, and now people would have to decide for themselves what to believe. The knock came again, and this time it was accompanied by a voice I recognised as my own. "Mrs. Chen, I'm looking for my friend Elliot. I think he might be in trouble." Perfect mimicry. If I hadn't known better, I would have believed it was me. But there was something just slightly off about the tone. Something too controlled, too calm for someone who was genuinely worried about a missing friend. "Back door," Mrs. Chen whispered. "My car is in the garage. Keys are on the kitchen counter." I gathered the few belongings I'd brought with me and headed for her back door. But as I reached for the handle, I saw another figure standing in her backyard. This one looked like my father. Or rather, like the man I'd thought was my father for the past few months. Veil one, waiting patiently by the back fence. They'd anticipated our escape routes. Of course they had. My copy would have known how I thought, and Veil one had been observing my behaviour patterns for months. But there was one thing they might not have considered. Mrs. Chen's house backed up to a storm drain system that connected to the larger infrastructure under our suburb. I'd explored those tunnels as a kid, back when urban exploration seemed like an adventure rather than a survival skill. "The basement," I told Mrs. Chen. "There's an old foundation crack that connects to the storm system. I can get out that way." She nodded and handed me an envelope. Emergency cash, untraceable phone, and contact information for some people who might be able to help you. "Be careful, Elliot." "What about you?" "I'll be fine. I'm just a teacher who got fooled by some sophisticated propaganda, remember? That's the official story, and I plan to stick to it." The knock at the front door was getting more insistent, and I could hear my own voice calling out with increasing concern. "Mrs. Chen, please, I just need to talk to Elliot. I'm worried about him." I made it to her basement just as I heard the back door being tested. The foundation crack was smaller than I remembered from childhood, but adrenaline and desperation made me flexible. I squeezed through into the storm drain system and began crawling toward the main tunnel network. Behind me, I could hear muffled voices as the copies entered Mrs. Chen's house. I hoped she would be okay. I hoped they would believe her story about being an innocent victim of foreign disinformation. But as I crawled through the dark, wet tunnels beneath my suburban neighbourhood, I realised that hope was a luxury I could no longer afford. The people behind Project Reflection had managed to turn my attempt to expose them into evidence of their enemy's capabilities. They'd made themselves the victims of the very conspiracy they were actually running. And now I was alone, hunted by copies of myself and my father, with nothing but a leaked story that most of the world had already dismissed as fake news. But I'd learned something important in those first few hours after our leak went viral. The truth had power, even when it was being suppressed. People were asking questions, sharing information, connecting dots. The conspiracy might have contained the immediate damage, but they couldn't control every conversation, every doubt, every person who'd seen our evidence and decided to keep looking. Project Reflection was real. The copies were everywhere. And now that I knew the truth, I had a choice to make: run and hide, or find a way to fight back. I emerged from the storm system 3 miles from Mrs. Chen's house, in an industrial area near the highway. Using the phone she'd given me, I accessed one of the secure channels we'd set up for the leak. The conversation threads were still active, still growing. People were sharing their own observations, their own suspicions about public figures who'd seemed different after various incidents. One message thread caught my attention. It was from someone claiming to be a former government contractor who'd heard rumours about Project Reflection years ago. The message included coordinates for a location in West Virginia and a simple statement: "If you're the real Elliot Vale, and if you're still alive, come alone." We have a lot to talk about. It could be a trap. It probably was a trap. But as I watched traffic heading west on the highway, I realised I didn't have many other options. I was 16 years old, my father was floating in a tank somewhere, and my entire life had been managed by people who saw human consciousness as just another form of software to be updated and improved. But I was still me, the real me, and that had to count for something. 3 weeks later, I'm writing this from a location I can't name, working with people I can't identify, planning things I can't discuss. The world still believes Project Reflection is foreign disinformation. The copies are still active, still playing their roles, still maintaining the illusion that everything is normal. But we're out here. The real ones who got away, the family members who figured it out, the investigators who dug too deep. We're building something, a network, a resistance, a way to fight back against people who think human beings are just biological hardware to be optimized. They called it Project Reflection, and I'm starting to understand why. It wasn't just about creating copies of people. It was about creating a world that reflected their vision of how humanity should behave. Compliant, predictable, controllable. But reflections are just images. They're not real. And the real world is about to fight back. Welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to connect with you, wherever you are in this world. How was your day? What time is it where you're listening? Are you settling in for the night in New York, catching this during your morning commute in London, or perhaps listening while the sun sets in California? Whatever brought you here tonight, thank you for joining us. If you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries that haunt our recent history, please subscribe to Sleep Theories. Your support helps us continue uncovering the stories they'd rather you forget. Now let me tell you about my friend Terry, Officer Terence Yeakey, and let me tell you why, 28 years later, I still check my rearview mirror twice before I park. The morning of April 19th, 1995 started like any other Wednesday in Oklahoma City. I was working dispatch when the call came in at 9:02 a.m. At first, we thought it was a gas explosion, maybe a boiler malfunction at the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. The initial reports were confused, fragmented. Someone screaming about a collapsed building. Children crying. The word bomb hadn't even entered our vocabulary yet. Terry was 3 blocks away when it happened. Officer Terence Yeakey, Oklahoma City Police Department, badge number 573. He was the kind of cop who still believed the badge meant something. Still believed we were the good guys. He was the first one inside the rubble, and maybe that's where his life ended, even if he didn't know it yet. I didn't see Terry until that evening. When he finally made it back to the station, he looked like he'd aged 10 years in 8 hours. His uniform was covered in concrete dust and blood, some his own, most belonging to the people he'd pulled from the wreckage. His hands were cut to hell from digging through twisted metal and broken glass, but his eyes were different, haunted in a way I'd never seen before. "How many?" I asked him as he sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk. 4 confirmed saves, he said quietly. Maybe more. Hard to tell in all that chaos. The news was already calling him a hero. Officer Yiki, first responder, saviour of innocence. They'd interview him the next day, and he'd give them the standard lines about doing his duty, about how anyone would have done the same. But that night, sitting in our nearly empty station house, he wasn't thinking about heroism. Something's not right about this whole thing, he said, staring at his bandaged hands. What do you mean? Terry looked around the room, even though we were practically alone. How fast they got there. The feds, I mean. The TF, FBI, agents I didn't recognise. They were suiting up and organising before our backup even arrived. Maybe they were in the area. Maybe. But the way he said it told me he didn't believe that for a second. That was the beginning. The first crack in Terry's faith in the system he'd sworn to serve. Over the next few days, as the official story began to take shape, domestic terrorist Timothy McVeigh, lone wolf, fertilizer bomb in a rental truck, Terry started asking questions that made people uncomfortable. He'd always been thorough, is what made him a good cop. But after the bombing, his thoroughness became something else, an obsession. He started keeping a journal, writing down everything he remembered from that morning. Every detail, no matter how small. The position of vehicles, the timing of arrivals, the faces of agents who seemed to know exactly where to go in a building that had just been destroyed. I'm going to figure this out, he told me about a week after the bombing. Something happened in that building that they don't want us to know about. Terry, maybe you should talk to someone, a counsellor. What you saw in there? This isn't PTSD, he cut me off. This is about the truth. He rented a safety deposit box at a bank across town, started making copies of everything, his incident reports, photographs he'd taken with his personal camera, witness statements that didn't make it into the official record. He became paranoid about his regular locker at the station, convinced someone was going through his things. They're watching me, he told his ex-wife Tonya during one of their phone calls about their kids. She'd tell me about it later, after everything happened, how Terry's voice had changed, how he'd started checking his car for tracking devices. The Heroes Medal ceremony was scheduled for May 1996. The mayor wanted to present it personally. Local news would be there. It should have been the highlight of Terry's career. Instead, he spent those weeks talking about federal agents who arrived too quickly, about surveillance footage that disappeared, about explosive residue patterns that didn't match the official story. He said he didn't trust anyone anymore, Tonya would tell me years later. He didn't even trust me by the end. By the fall of 1995, Terry had changed. The easy smile was gone. He'd lost weight, started working double shifts, claiming he needed the overtime, but I knew he was avoiding going home to an empty apartment where he'd lie awake replaying that morning over and over. He'd developed a routine. Every Friday after his shift, he'd drive to that bank across town and spend an hour in the safety deposit box room, adding pages to his growing file. Sometimes he'd come back to the station afterward looking grim. "Find something interesting?" I asked one evening. "You ever notice how fast the ATF response team got to the scene?" Terry asked instead of answering. "They're trained for this kind of thing." "They're trained, sure, but they're not psychic." Terry pulled out a small notebook, not his official one, but a personal journal he'd started keeping. According to radio logs, first ATF agents were on scene at 9:17 a.m, 15 minutes after the blast. So, their offices are in Dallas. It's a 3.5-hour drive to Oklahoma City. How'd they get there so fast? I thought about it. Maybe they were already in town. For what? There was no ATF operation in Oklahoma City that morning. I checked. His voice dropped. Unless there was one they didn't want us to know about. That's when Terry started talking about what he'd seen inside the building. Not the heroic rescue parts that made it into the news reports, but the other things. The inconsistencies. "I found a man on the 3rd floor," he told me one night, crushed under debris, probably dead for an hour, but his watch had stopped at 9:04. Watches break in explosions, Terry. Sure, but his body was warm, fresh blood, like he'd been injured after the blast, not during it. Terry's paranoia was becoming infectious. I started noticing things too. How certain federal agents seemed to know exactly where to look in the wreckage, how quickly they cordoned off sections of the building, how witness statements were being revised to match the official timeline. But it was the photographs that really convinced me Terry was onto something. He'd brought his personal camera to the scene, against regulations, but in the chaos, nobody noticed. The pictures he took in those first crucial hours showed things that didn't make it into the FBI's evidence collection. "Look at this," he said, spreading the photos across his kitchen table. "See that van parked behind the building?" I looked. There was indeed a white van, positioned oddly close to the rear of the federal building. Now look at this photo, taken 30 minutes later. The van was gone. Could have been moved by emergency crews. Could have been, but look at the license plate in the first photo. I squinted. The plate was partially visible but readable. "Did you run it?" "I tried. Came back as classified. Government vehicle." Terry had dozens of these photographs. Vehicles that appeared and disappeared. People in federal jackets who seemed to be directing operations before any official command structure was established. Areas of the building that were sealed off immediately before proper forensic teams arrived. "They knew," Terry said quietly. "Somehow, they knew this was going to happen." The next week, Terry's apartment was broken into. Nothing valuable was taken. His TV, stereo, cash were all untouched. But his home office had been carefully searched. Papers shuffled through, computer files accessed. "Professional job," Terry told me. "Whoever did this knew what they were looking for." That's when he started varying his routes to work, started using payphones instead of his home line, started making copies of copies and storing them in multiple locations. "I'm not crazy," he insisted. "Someone doesn't want me asking these questions." His ex-wife Tonia started getting strange phone calls, hang-ups, voices asking about Terry's whereabouts. She began limiting the kids' visits to his apartment. "He told me he had evidence that would blow the case wide open," she'd tell investigators later. "Said he was going to take it to someone at the Department of Justice who could be trusted." By Christmas 1995, Terry was talking about federal agents inside the building before the explosion. Not arriving after, inside, already there, like they'd been waiting. "I saw 3 men in ATF jackets on the second floor," he told me. "They were taking photographs of something. This was maybe 10 minutes after the blast. But here's the thing, the stairwell they came down from was completely blocked by debris. Had been since the explosion. So how'd they get up there?" I didn't have an answer for that. "There's another way into that building," Terry continued. "Has to be. And they knew about it." January 1996. That's when I started noticing my own phone acting strange. Clicks and delays. Conversations that felt like they had extra ears listening. I'd always dismissed Terry's paranoia as trauma-induced hypervigilance, but suddenly I wasn't so sure. The breaking point came when I tried to access security footage from police headquarters. Routine request. I was working on an unrelated case and needed to review some tape from the week of the bombing. The footage wasn't there. Not erased, not corrupted. Gone. Like it had never existed. "Maintenance issue," the tech told me. "System crashed that whole week. We lost everything." But I'd seen that footage myself right after the bombing. Watched Terry coming and going, noted the federal agents who'd visited our station. Now it was all gone. Terry wasn't surprised when I told him. "They're cleaning house," he said. "Getting rid of anything that doesn't fit their story." That's when he showed me the real evidence. The stuff he'd been keeping in his safety deposit box. Copies of witness statements that had been revised by federal agents. Photographs of explosive residue patterns that didn't match a single truck bomb. Audio recordings of radio transmissions that were missing from official logs. "Look at this," Terry said, pointing to a photograph of the building's interior. "See that support column? According to the FBI, the truck bomb outside should have caused the progressive collapse we saw. But look at the blast pattern." I looked. The column showed signs of damage from the inside out, not outside in. "That's not from a truck bomb in the street," Terry continued. "That's from charges placed inside the building." "Jesus, Terry, you're talking about—" "I'm talking about a coordinated attack using Timothy McVeigh as a patsy. Someone wanted that building to come down and they wanted it to look like domestic terrorism." The recordings were even more damning. Radio chatter from that morning that captured federal agents coordinating movements inside the building. while local responders were still trying to establish a perimeter outside. Agent Rodriguez, 3rd floor is clear for sweep. Copy that. Package is secure. Moving to extraction point Alpha. Package? I asked. That's what I want to know, Terry said. What package? And why were they extracting it while people were still trapped in the rubble? By February, Terry was talking about taking his evidence to the Department of Justice. He'd made contact with someone, he wouldn't tell me who worked in internal affairs. Someone who could be trusted to investigate without alerting the wrong people. I'm going to Washington next month, he told me, going to hand-deliver everything. That's when the real harassment started. Terry's car was vandalised 3 times in 2 weeks. His apartment building's fire alarm went off at 3 a.m. every night for a week. Maintenance could never find the problem. He started getting followed by cars with government plates. They want me to know they're watching, he said. Want me to get scared and back off. But Terry wasn't backing off. If anything, the intimidation made him more determined. I pulled 4 people out of that building, he told me. 4 lives. I held a little girl while she died because the ceiling came down on her before I could get her out. If there's a chance that her death was part of some government operation, I owe it to her to find out. The medal ceremony was rescheduled for May 8, 1996. The mayor's office wanted to coordinate with national media. Terry's story had gained attention, and they wanted to capitalise on the positive publicity. Terry told them he wasn't sure he could attend. Bad timing, he said when they pressed him. I might be travelling. On May 6th, Terry called in sick to work. Said he had the flu, but his neighbour saw him leaving his apartment that morning carrying a large envelope and a small suitcase. He looked nervous, the neighbour would tell police later. Kept checking over his shoulder. That was the last time anyone saw Terence Yeakey alive. May 8th, 1996. The day Terry was supposed to receive his medal for heroism. Instead, his body was found in a field outside El Reno, 40 miles west of Oklahoma City. I got the call at 6 a.m. Captain Morrison's voice was flat, professional. We found Yeakey. You need to get down here. The scene was wrong from the moment I arrived. Terry's car was parked on a dirt road, doors unlocked, keys in the ignition. But his body was more than a mile away, across rough terrain dotted with barbed wire and thick brush. The official cause of death was suicide, but I've seen suicides. This wasn't one. Terry's wrist had been slashed, deep cuts that went to the bone. His arms were lacerated with dozens of smaller wounds. There were ligature marks around his neck, like he'd been strangled or hanged. And finally, a single gunshot wound to the head. Hell of a way to kill yourself, the coroner muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The investigator in charge was FBI agent Sarah Chen. I'd never seen her before the bombing, but she'd been assigned to several OKC-related cases since then. Clear case of suicide, she announced before the forensics team had even finished processing the scene. Officer Yeakey was obviously distraught about what he witnessed during the bombing. PTSD, guilt over not saving more people. He drove out here to end his suffering. With what gun? I asked. Agent Chen looked annoyed. What? You said he shot himself. Where's the weapon? We're still processing the scene. They never found a gun. Not that day. Not ever. So he slashed his wrists, cut up his arms, somehow strangled himself, walked a mile through rough terrain while bleeding out, then shot himself in the head with a gun that disappeared, I said to Agent Chen. Stranger things have happened. But they hadn't. Not in 20 years of police work. The blood evidence told a different story. There was no blood trail from the car to where Terry's body was found. If he'd cut his wrist at the car and walked that distance, there should have been a clear path of blood drops. Instead, the first blood was found about 50 yards from the body. Like he was carried or dragged most of the way, the forensics photographer told me quietly. But don't quote me on that. Terry's family was devastated and confused. His ex-wife Tonya insisted he'd never talked about suicide. His sister said he'd seemed excited about something recently, not depressed. He called me 2 days ago, Tonya told investigators. Said he was finally going to get some answers, that people were going to know the truth. The official investigation lasted exactly 1 week. Agent Chen concluded that Officer Terence Yeakey had killed himself due to severe PTSD related to his experiences during the Oklahoma City bombing response. Case closed. But when Terry's family went to collect his personal effects from his apartment, they found it had already been cleaned out. Federal agents had been there first. Said they were looking for evidence related to his mental state, Tonya was told, for the investigation. Terry's safety deposit box was also emptied. The bank manager said federal agents had presented a court order. When Terry's lawyer requested a copy of the order, he was told it was sealed for national security reasons. "Everything's gone," Terry's sister called to tell me. "His files, his photographs, his journals, they took everything." Even his service weapon was missing from the evidence room. The gun that should have been logged and secured when his body was found was nowhere to be found. Clerical error, I was told when I asked about it. Sometimes things get misfiled. The ones who claimed to protect us cleaned up before we could ask why he died. At Terry's funeral, I counted at least 6 federal agents in attendance. They didn't participate in the service, just watched from the back, taking notes, recording who came, who spoke, who seemed upset or angry. Agent Chen approached me afterward. Officer Yiki was obviously troubled, she said. Sometimes good cops get too deep into conspiracy theories, start seeing connections that aren't there. It's a tragedy, but it happens. What about his evidence? What evidence? We didn't find any evidence, just the confused notes of a man suffering from severe psychological trauma. That night I went to Terry's bank, told them I was his partner, investigating his death. The safety deposit box attendant was nervous. "Those federal agents," she said quietly. "They were here before we even heard about Officer Yiki's death. How'd they know to come here if he'd just been found?" I didn't have an answer for that either. It's been 28 years since Terry died. 28 years since my friend and fellow officer was found dead in a field, with wounds that told a story the government didn't want anyone to read. I'm retired now, moved away from Oklahoma City in 2003, changed my name in 2008. I tell people I'm paranoid, and maybe I am, but I'm alive, which is more than I can say for several people who asked too many questions about April 19th, 1995. Terry wasn't the only first responder who started asking uncomfortable questions about the bombing. Officer Gordon Martin died in a car accident in 1997. A single vehicle crash, no witnesses. Paramedic James Norris died of a heart attack in 1998, age 34, no history of heart problems. Fire Captain Jeff Kautzman committed suicide in 2000, according to the official report, though his family insisted he'd never shown signs of depression. All of them had been at the Murrah building that morning. All of them had seen things that didn't match the official story. I kept quiet for a long time, told myself that Terry's death really had been suicide, that my suspicions were just grief and paranoia. But time has a way of clarifying things, and the older I get, the more certain I become that my friend was murdered for what he knew. The Oklahoma City bombing was the worst domestic terrorist attack in American history until 9/11. It changed how we think about security, about government buildings, about the threat of homegrown extremism. It justified new laws, new powers, new levels of surveillance. But what if the official story is wrong? What if Terry was right about federal involvement? What if Timothy McVeigh was just the visible part of a larger operation? I've spent decades thinking about what Terry found in that building, the evidence he collected, the photographs that showed federal agents in places they shouldn't have been, at times that didn't make sense. In his final weeks, Terry talked about a package that federal agents had extracted from the building while rescue operations were still ongoing, something they'd gone in to retrieve while people were still trapped in the rubble. What was worth more than human lives? Files, maybe, evidence of other operations or people, informants, assets, agents who needed to be extracted before their covers were blown. The ATF had offices in the Murrah building. So did the FBI, the DEA, and the Secret Service. All agencies that conduct classified operations, maintain sensitive files, run informant networks. If you wanted to destroy evidence of government wrongdoing, a terrorist attack would be perfect cover. Blame the destruction on Timothy McVeigh. Use the tragedy to justify expanded powers and eliminate anyone who saw too much. Terry saw too much. I think about him often, especially on April 19th each year. I think about the man who ran into a collapsing building to save strangers, who pulled 4 people from the rubble, who held a dying child in his arms and promised her everything would be okay. That man deserved better than to die alone in a field, tortured and murdered for trying to uncover the truth. His medal is probably sitting in some government warehouse now, alongside all the evidence they confiscated from his apartment and safety deposit box. A hero's commendation for a man they killed to keep quiet. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Terry had just kept his mouth shut, if he'd accepted the official story and let the inconsistencies slide. He might still be alive today. Retired maybe, playing with grandchildren. But that wasn't Terry. He was a cop who believed in justice, even when justice put him in danger. Especially then. If there's one thing I want people to remember about Terence Yeakey, it's that he died trying to tell the truth. In an age when truth seems increasingly negotiable, when official stories are crafted by committees and focus groups, Terry represents something pure, something honourable. He saw what he saw, he documented what he could, he asked the questions that needed asking, and they killed him for it. I've never spoken publicly about any of this before, never put these thoughts on paper. But I'm old now, and the people who silenced Terry might not care as much about silencing me. Or maybe they will, and this will be the last thing I write. If something happens to me, if I die in a car accident or have a sudden heart attack or commit suicide in some implausible way, remember that I was in good health when I wrote this. Remember that I had no reason to kill myself. Remember that I was careful. The truth about Oklahoma City died with Terry in that field outside El Reno, but questions remain. Evidence exists somewhere, and maybe, someday, someone braver than me will find it and share it with the world. Until then, we're left with the official story. Timothy McVeigh, lone wolf domestic terrorist, fertilizer bomb, 168 dead. But if Terry was right, if federal agents were inside that building before the explosion, if evidence was extracted while people died in the rubble, if the whole thing was something other than what we've been told, then we're living with a lie that cost 168 lives and continues to shape American policy today. If he killed himself, why did they erase everything he left behind? That's the question that keeps me awake at night. 28 years later, it's the question that haunts me more than any other. Terry knew something worth killing for, and now, so do you.